Hello, theorists. This recording is going to be a bit of a review for you, but it's going to look at things from a slightly different point of view. We're going to look at consonance and dissonance, and we're going to start by just understanding what this means in the Renaissance. In the Renaissance era, you don't have chords, so a 2 chord doesn't naturally go to a 5 chord, and a 5 chord doesn't naturally go to a 1 chord. Those things push the music forward. They create this tension that wants to relax, and that's what gives functional tonal music, the music we've been studying, so much power. Well, before you have chords, what drove the music forward were dissonances that had to resolve. If you have a dissonance, that just means anything that has to resolve, and it wants to resolve to a consonant, so it pushes you forward. It creates some tension and release. So let's do a quick review first of all. Consonant is any chord or any interval that needs to resolve. So in terms of intervals in the Renaissance, and this changes in different time periods. Remember, the language of music changes. But in the Renaissance, the dissonant intervals are the seconds, either major or minor, doesn't matter. The fourth, that's a surprise, but the fourth is dissonant, has to resolve. The tritone and the seventh, major, minor, doesn't matter. Everything else is consonant. The unison, the third, the fifth, the sixth, the octave, all consonant. But those other intervals have to resolve. And so in the Renaissance, if you have those intervals measured from the bass, we always measure our dissonances from the bass, not from between, because any chord, anytime you have an octave, and a unison, a third, and a fifth, if you put the octave above it, there's a fourth in there. The fifth and the octave forms a fourth. So we have to measure everything from one voice. It's always from the bottom. But if you have a dissonance, it wants to resolve. And the Renaissance doesn't want to keep that tension a long time. The Romantic era will keep that tension sometimes for an hour. I mean, it's huge how long we keep that suspended attention. Oh. But when you're in the Renaissance, they'll have it for a brief moment and they'll resolve. And in your book, they go over so many of these dissonances. Many of them you've learned before, but they have very specific rules in the Renaissance. So there's a lot of passing tones. Passing tones are not uncommon. There are also accented passing tones. Remember, unaccented passing tones just mean they come out a weak beat or they come between beats. The accented passing tones come on the beat. And I check out the book about when accented passing tones are allowed. It's all in the book, and I don't want to repeat the book. Otherwise, there's no point to read it. There's also neighbor tones, and neighbor tones are just notes that go up. I think that they only do up and not down, or vice versa. The Renaissance, look it up in the book. Again, I don't want to go over all those details. We'll talk about what it means when we say you can't do a lower neighbor tone in the Renaissance. It doesn't mean you can't do a lower one. It means when we look at all that music, and we do it by computer now. All the stuff's on MIDI. And that means that MIDI is just computer data. So you run it through a computer, and you find out that 99.9 or 97.8% of the time, a neighbor tone goes up. So it's very rare the other way. So we say that basically it was avoided in the Renaissance. Probably not forbidden. Probably just they didn't like it. They didn't do it very much. If we want to imitate them, we don't do it either. But realize that there's this rule that, for like the Bible, we to give this rule that composers, thou shalt not write a neighbor tone in this direction. It's just that there were tastes, and we can measure those tastes by computers. We'll talk about that in class. But there's a couple of tricky dissonances. So one is a suspension. And I know you've learned the suspension, but let's just remember what happens on a suspension. On a weak beat, you've got some kind of stacking of notes that's all consonant, or at least the note that we're looking at is consonant. And we tie that over to a strong beat, so it's exactly the same note, but the bass has changed. And because the bass has changed, that note's now a dissonance. It has to resolve downward by step. So the next beat, it resolves downward by step, sometimes with some ornamentation, but it goes down by step, and then it's consonant. You can also have it in the bass, where the bass moves, but it's the bass note, or the bass doesn't move, other notes move. So the bass note's the one that's dissonant, and it has to resolve. Little trickier to see, but it's the same idea. We tie over one note to the strong beat, other notes change, and so the note that's tied over changes from being a consonant to a dissonant, has to resolve. If you have a question about that, looking at the book and everything else, bring it up in class. I can do some demonstrations of it. It's a little bit tricky. Sometimes when it resolves a quarter note early. In the later eras, we call that an anticipation. In the Renaissance, we call it a portamento. Why do we change the name? It's so unclear why the names are different in the Renaissance than they are in the classical era, but nonetheless, if you have a note that has to resolve, that resolves a chord note early, like an anticipation, we call it a portamento. Big deal. You know, the other one that's tricky is a figure called the cambiata or nota cambiata, the combined notes. This is what in the classical era we'd call changing tones. And so you have a consonant note, and then you're going to go to a consonant note. Say let's say there's four notes. It's ba 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 ba. So it goes down a step, down a third, back up a step. First note is consonant. Second note is dissonant. So then the third note can be consonant or dissonant. The fourth note can be consonant or dissonant. One of them must be consonant. So if you're doing a passing tone, da da da, you can go da da dee da. So the first and last note are the consonants. You're filling it in, but you ornament it. Or if you've got a fourth that's consonant, da da da, and then passing tone, da da. So the first note and the third note can be consonant. I'm not explaining it well, but basically you go down a step, you go from a consonant note to a dissonant note. Instead of resolving right away, you leap either to a consonant note or come back up to a dissonant note. So it's down a step, down a third, back up a step, first note, third note, or fourth note consonant. Look at the examples in the book now we've described it, and you'll see how it works. It's actually very common, so it's not like, oh, I'm not going to learn that one. If you want to sound like a Renaissance composer, you got to have the nota cambiata. And we're going to see in Mozart, it becomes the changing tones, and it's very common in Mozart, even in Bach. So let's just realize that that's a thing we have to learn. Again, what I'm trying to do is give you information that you can look at the book and hear my voice and then ask me questions. This is just a rough demonstration. Okay, so basically we have the dissonance are suspensions, nota cambiata, passing tones, and certain kinds of neighbor tones. And you notice they all reserve fast. They all reserve within a beat so that we don't keep the tension for long. That's what gives the smoothness to this music. Just enough tension to make it move forward and just enough consonants to keep it smooth and lovely. That's what makes the Renaissance Renaissance. That's how you can recognize the music from this time period. But these basic rules become the rules of later time periods. They just extend the amount of time they spend on a dissonance. They expand a little bit what kind of dissonances you can have. We start adding appoggiaturas. So we create longer and longer tensions, but it's really basically the same rules. We have to carefully approach a dissonance, and at some point we have to resolve that dissonance. That's all music is. Literally, that's all music is. See you in class.